Oh, hi there. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, your B-Movie proctologist. Now, I'm the guy who has to get up in there and clear out some of the stinky, nasty, bad movies that can get lodged in, well, quite frankly, aren't that easy to flush. But that's not so much the case this week. No, this week's movie is one that I actually kind of adore for a handful of reasons. It's why my trusty companion, Nurse Disembody, and I are reading these old famous Monsters of Filmland magazines. In a way, these magazines do kind of play into this week's movie, but to tell us more about this week's movie, I now turn it over to Nurse Disembody. Nurse?
On this week's episode of B-Movie Enema the series, Jeff is going to talk about 1989's My Mom's a Werewolf. It's about a girl named Jennifer whose mom is seduced by neighborhood werewolf man John Saxon. She has to save her mom, avoid the werewolf man's charms, and get the help of her monster-loving friend to save the day before Jennifer really can say, "My mom's a werewolf."
Thanks, Nurse Disembody. Now, I'll come back around to My Mom's a Werewolf in just a moment, but I want to talk a little bit more about Famous Monsters. You see, Famous Monsters of Filmland was created by Forrest J. Ackerman and was originally conceived as a single-issue one-shot with James Warren's Warren Publications after the television success of Shock Theater. Now, someday I suspect we'll probably need to dive a little bit deeper into Shock Theater because, well, you could probably argue that I wouldn't be here doing this show or many other horror hosts that you've seen over the years, if not for Zachary. But anyway, Ackerman, or Forey as many would like to call him, was pretty famous for ushering in the idea of the monster kid. Now, these are kids who grew up watching horror movies and being wowed by the various monsters and creatures, both classic and contemporary. Famous Monsters brought the fun of horror and sci-fi home for pretty much a younger audience. Ackerman would end up publishing Famous Monsters semi-regularly at first in early 1958, but before long it became a monthly publication until 1983. So it was there for everything big, from its beginnings of looking back at the earlier monsters and the huge successes of the kitschy sci-fi era, but also the newer era of the 70s and the return of King Kong and Star Trek, but also those phenomenons such as the Star Wars trilogy and the first two Superman movies. Ackerman's Little Monster Mag was pretty much required reading for many kids of the 60s, 70s, and the early 80s. When James Warren fell ill and was forced to leave Warren Publications, soon Ackerman would leave his magazine frustrated by the lack of leadership at the publisher. While the title has been revived twice since, it is now largely an annual published magazine. But without a doubt, though, Famous Monsters influenced a great many horror magazines today. In particular, I'd say Scary Monsters magazine owes itself entirely to Ackerman's publication, with newsprint, black and white pages, a monster kid zeal to its articles, and running commentary on older creatures of the night compared to the more contemporary stuff. But aside from that, without Famous Monsters, you wouldn't have things like Fangoria or Starlog or Horror Hound or the many other horror magazines that have been in and out of the magazine racks over the last 50 years or so. But let's get into our movie for this week, My Mom's a Werewolf. So, Nurse Disembody, I say let's just go ahead and dive into this little 80s werewolf flick.
Sure. It looks like a lot of fun.
You know, it really is. This isn't going to be too bad of a job this week. This is hardly as stinky and yucky as the movie that we had last week, but we'll come back after the completion of the first act, and I'll talk a little bit more about the more recognizable actors that are in this, and you know, really kind of dig a little bit deeper into those people as well. So let's get things started, and we'll see you here in a little bit. Say, Nurse Disembody, what are you reading about over there?
The 1976 version of King Kong.
Ooh. Do you mind if I see that when you're done? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about My Mom's a Werewolf. More specifically, the people who are in the movie. Now, the titular Mama Werewolf is Susan Blakely. Now, she started as a model in the 60s before moving to Hollywood in the early 70s, where she almost immediately started getting some pretty juicy supporting roles in movies like The Way We Were and The Towering Inferno. Things really, though, kicked off for her when she was in the TV miniseries Rich Man, Poor Man. What's kind of interesting is that you don't have to look very far before you find some pretty, well, pretty pictures of her online from her modeling and earlier acting days. Now, here are some examples right over here. Now, in this movie, she's kind of played down as a bored housewife and mother who is kind of put upon by her husband who works all the time and isn't really in for her bullshit cooking, and a teenager who is really starting to grow up and leave the house more often. She's not exactly played up as a sex symbol in this, at least to a certain point, I suppose. Because we have our ravenous, toe-sucking pet store guy who likes to eat live mice right out of the tank, who has a particular interest in her. And of course, he's played by John Saxon. Now, Saxon unfortunately passed away in 2020, but he starred in an assload of movies over the course of 60 years. He got a lot of parts in TV too, so between being in a ton of movies both stateside and for Italian filmmakers, he showed up in a ton of westerns in the 60s. Now, he's probably best known, at least for my viewers, for the Nightmare on Elm Street series as Nancy's cop father in the first and third films, and as sort of himself in New Nightmare. Beyond that, he's been in movies like Argento's Tenebrae, Martino's The Scorpion with Two Tails, Cronenberg's Fast Company, Enter the Dragon. He had a cameo appearance in From Dusk Till Dawn, and like Martin Balsam last week, he was even in Mitchell. There are a shit ton of movies and TV shows that I could mention for him, but you can find all of that stuff on IMDb. The fortune teller at the horror and sci-fi convention was Ruth Buzzy. Now, of course, she's best known for Laugh-In, but let's talk about that convention. I'm a huge fan of horror and Comic-Cons myself, and while I will talk more about our teenagers in the next section, I 1000% would go to the horror and sci-fi con with Jennifer's friend Stacy. Where were girls like that when I was in high school and was a teenager? But anyway, Jennifer's dad, Howard, is John Schuck. Now, here's a guy who had an interesting career. Early on, he was in the film MASH, which is hardly anything to sneeze at. He found his way into many popular TV shows throughout his career. He was on shows like Mary Tyler Moore Show, The Golden Girls, St. Elsewhere, Different Strokes, Law and Order SVU, but he got to play Herman Munster in the late 80s revival of The Munsters. But eagle-eyed Trekkies will probably know him best as the Klingon ambassador that called for no peace as long as Kirk shall live in Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Later, he would reprise the same role and cheer Kirk and the Enterprise crew after they stopped the assassination attempt on the Federation president that would have led to all-out war between the Federation and the Klingon Empire in Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. But anyway, the great thing about Star Trek is...
Maybe we should get back to the movie?
I guess. I guess we can do that. But when we come back for our third segment, we'll talk more about the young actors playing Jennifer and Stacy. Say, Nurse Disembody, would you ever want to go to a convention, like a sci-fi and horror convention?
Maybe. Do I have to wear a costume?
That's probably a real possibility that you would.
What could I possibly wear?
Stacy just had that like vampire cape and the fangs and a little bit of makeup, and it was working for her. I think that'd be a good look on you too.
I'm not sure.
Anyway, I'll let you get back to the movie, and we'll see you here in a little while. Well, it's starting to look like things are getting a little hairy for Jennifer's mom. You know, I didn't really bring this up that much previously because we were talking about the better known actors that are in this movie, but I do wonder if this movie was supposed to feature a vampire. I mean, like, John Saxon is going around with fangs and he has this ability to seemingly glamour or possibly hypnotize people. In a little bit, we're going to see Jennifer try to use garlic to repel him. And he has this kind of psychic connection to Susan Blakely. But I kind of feel like this was going to be a vampire movie. And then someone said, hey, let's make this werewolves. And, you know, the rest was basically history. All right, so let's talk about our teenage leads because this will kind of help with an explanation for the first segment, but also leads to a question that I have at the end of the movie. Now, Jennifer is played by Tina Caspary. Now, Ms. Caspary was all over the cult movie pop culture scene in the late 80s. She was in the amazingly craptastic Mac and Me, which is about as watchable a bad movie as you can possibly make. In 1989, she wasn't just in this movie, but she was also in the teen girl cult classic Teen Witch. Now, that was originally supposed to be in the same universe as Teen Wolf. So I have to guess that she couldn't really get away from werewolves in 1989. However, after Teen Witch and My Mom's a Werewolf, she would go missing for the next 5 years or so before appearing in an episode of Valley of the Dolls, which, according to Internet Movie Database, is her last credit. So she's now retired, married, and a mother. But I cannot go without saying, though, that she was in a segment of Michael Nesmith's television parts in 1985, and that's fucking awesome. But as fucking awesome as the actress playing Jennifer is, because she was in television parts, and that she was also in the trifecta of Mac and Me, My Mom's a Werewolf, and Teen Witch, my movie crush for this movie has to go to Diana Barrows, who plays Stacy. First off, the first time I saw this movie, I immediately recognized her from another late 80s classic, Friday the 13th Part 7. She played a sort of mousy girl in that who just wanted to get laid and noticed by guys. And unfortunately, that would prove to be her downfall, though, as that pretty much called down the thunder of Jason Voorhees. Her character in that, Maddie, is one of the more unfortunate deaths in all of the Friday the 13th franchise, at least in my opinion. She just wanted a dude to like her, and she got her ass killed for it. Anyway, in this, Stacy, and by the way, if you don't think I don't know that her last name, or what her last name is, you're nuts. Her last name in this is Poobah. Stacy Poobah is her name. Anyway, I am into this monster magazine reading spaz that she is. If we were to be total dogs, Jennifer, I suppose, would be the kind of girl that most guys at school would have paid more attention to, I guess. I mean, but Stacy would have been my date to the costume party and the next Horror Hound convention. Sorry, Nurse D, but I'm going to have to take her instead.
That is quite all right by me.
Okay. I talked about all that Famous Monsters of Filmland stuff at the beginning of this episode because not only is it mentioned in the horror and sci-fi convention scene, but Stacy is totally that monster kid, and and is definitely a love letter to that whole idea, right? I mean, like the people making movies in the 80s, especially movies like this, or like the Monster Squad or whatever, are most definitely growing up on 4E stuff. It's just kind of a nice thing. It's nice to have this sort of character in a movie, especially hanging out with the main protagonist, who is likely a popular kid. It makes other monster kids like me feel kind of good and valid. Another thing that should be pointed out in this is that this movie features two teenage girls acting as the primary protagonists. Younger people being the leads were kind of a big thing in the 80s, but it was usually boys with one or two supporting girls that one of the boys maybe would have had a crush on or was a sister character or something like this. This actually features the two teenage girls as really the leads of this movie. That's something that really shouldn't be taken too lightly, especially considering that this is written and directed by men. And in a studio film, I'm guessing they would have made the teens either brother and sister or two guys or whatever. This being released through Crown International Pictures, though, they probably didn't have to worry too much about a mandate to have boys as the leads. It's neat and kind of lends to an aesthetic that makes this movie incredibly likable. All right, so let's get into the final act of My Mom's a Werewolf, and I'll see you back here after the movie is over. Well, that was My Mom's a Werewolf with some pretty sweet tunes at the end there. So what did you think of it, Nurse Disembody?
It was okay. I mean, it's a little silly, but it was also fun. It has a nice light-hearted feel to it. The characters are likable, and it had a couple good jokes, but it is definitely silly.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. It's definitely silly, but man, I just cannot dislike this movie. This is one of the very first articles I ever wrote on the B-Movie Enema blog. Admittedly, I went into creating that blog thinking I would just tear into movie after movie and have a good old time being one of those angry online critics, right? Well, this one was almost too wholesome to do that too. Now, that said, though, I do have a bit of a criticism for this movie.
What's that?
Well, I'm a little confused as to who this movie was made for. I mean, yes, it was made in the 80s, so, the decade that kids were lured in by hard R-rated horror movies with cable TV and videotape boxes. But I say it like that because regardless of PG, PG-13, or R, any of those movies could potentially be attractive to kids. So you have this movie that's this fun little 80s monster romp with teenage protagonists, a pop soundtrack, really a lack of many curse words outside of a couple of times people saying shit. Now there's this sort of wholesomeness to this movie that feels okay enough for teens and maybe even preteens to watch. But that said, there are less than wholesome things in this movie too. I mean, there's multiple scenes that either are or imply sex scenes. I mean, hell, one of those scenes had John Saxon not just open up Susan Blakely's dress. I mean, she was wearing underwear, so you don't really see anything. But don't worry, because John Saxon is also sucking her toe. And I'm guessing that was something the parents might have had to explain to kids after renting this for movie and pizza night. But if not that, I mean, also probably what was so weird about the dentist in the movie that made all the funny movements and moaning, in the scene where it seemed like she was getting humped by that said dentist while he was trying to file down her fangs. So there is the neighbor also that is into some pretty kinky shit who also gets a rise out of seeing Susan Blakely in her nightie. I mean, so who is this movie made for? I mean, the answer is, I don't really care because it's made for me. Is this movie flawed? Yes, sir. I mean, is this movie silly? Oh, you bet. Are there werewolves obviously wearing masks and not really wearing professional makeup? I mean, yes, they obviously are. Do I care? Fuck no, I don't care. I said I appreciated the movie in 2014 when I first covered it on the blog, and I'm going to say that I still feel that way today as it makes its way to B-Movie Enema, the series. Now, Nurse Disembody, tell them about the website and where you can find all of our stuff.
You can find all of Jeff's writings and upcoming episodes at www.bmovieenema.com. You can follow the page at Facebook and Twitter and check out episodes on YouTube. If you have a Roku, get OtherWorlds TV and check him out along with all the other hosts that appear there on weekends.
All right, thanks, Nurse. I feel pretty damn good after this movie. I mean, episode 1 was a little touch and go there. That was a disappointing flick. But this week, Well, I think I bounced back rather nicely, and I'm ready for another go next week.
Well, maybe you shouldn't feel too good about anything quite yet. I just got next week's appointment and it's another return customer.
Let me see this here. Wait a minute. Oh, no. Oh, no. No, no, no. Oh, no. Fuck.